I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, the sponsor of this conference. Welcome to our conference, The National Security State and the Kennedy Assassination. Y'all, I think most of y'all know, FFF is a nonprofit educational foundation. We've been in existence 30 years or more. Our mission is to present the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. And as part of that mission over the years, we have addressed a lot of our focus on the national security state, the type of governmental structure that we've had since World War II, compared it to a limited government republic, which is what we had for about the first 150 years, and showed what a disaster it's been to have converted the US government to a national security state. And a part of that, of course, is the regime change operations. I want to thank all of you that have supported FFF over the years. We couldn't do it without those of you that help us out, especially in a bigger way. And if you're not yet supporting our work, I would invite you to do so. We depend on support from our donors, and we would welcome and appreciate you becoming an active supporter of the Future of Freedom Foundation. The way this conference has developed in the first two presentations is we wanted to set the framework for what life was like before John Kennedy became president. Kennedy comes into office as pretty much a standard Cold Warrior, believing that the communists are coming to get us, they're enveloping the world and so forth. The version that the national security establishment was selling to the American people, in which they used to justify this conversion. Except there was a difference. As our first speaker, Jim DiEugenio, pointed out, Kennedy sympathized with third world independence movements in direct contradiction to the CIA and the Pentagon that considered these movements communist directed. So already there was tension before Kennedy even gets into office. And then with respect to Vietnam, our second speaker, Michael Swanson, pointed out that Kennedy was not interested in sending combat troops into Laos, Vietnam. He limited them to advisors. This was, again, direct contradiction to the Pentagon and the CIA, who believed that intervention in Southeast Asia was necessary to ensure that the communists didn't ultimately make it to the United States and conquer the United States. Now we're ready to head directly into the Kennedy administration. And we're honored and fortunate to have a speaker that is perfectly qualified to do that. So that's Dr. John Newman. Dr. Newman is an adjunct professor of political science at James Madison University. He is one of the most renowned scholars in the assassination research community. He's known for his scholarship, his devotion to accuracy, his meticulousness. Prior to teaching at James Madison, he was honors professor at the University of Maryland's Honors College. He's a career retired U.S. Army intelligence officer who served as a strategic intelligence cryptologic analyst. He received his BA in Chinese studies, an MA in Far Eastern studies, and a PhD in modern Far Eastern history at George Washington University. His seminal work, JFK in Vietnam, is still widely read today and recognized as an authoritative book about Kennedy and the Vietnam War. He was a consultant for Oliver Stone's movie, the JFK movie. He has written other books besides JFK and Vietnam, especially relating to the Kennedy assassination, Oswald and the CIA, and then 3 books called, there's sort of a series called Countdown to Darkness, Where Angels Tread Lightly, and Into the Storm, the third of which received accolades from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. So it's a real honor and a pleasure to welcome John Newman. Thank you, John, for taking the time to share your thoughts and your insights with us tonight.
And I want to thank you, Jacob Hornberger and Bart Frazier and the Future of Freedom Foundation for inviting me to participate in this really important event that's taking place over several months. My assignment this evening is to discuss my topic, JFK and the Cold War, deception, intrigue, treachery, and a struggle for power, primarily for a lay audience. Although I suspect many of you are experts already on some of the things I might be covering tonight. So in any event, what I've done is to put together a sort of high altitude, low resolution vantage point for you, with some exceptions where I might want to dip down into the trees briefly to have a look around. Now, the information for my presentation this evening comes from the evidence in my books, especially JFK in Vietnam, second edition, 2017. And of course, the series of books in my multi-volume series on the Kennedy presidency that Jacob just mentioned, so I won't mention them again. I hope that you appreciate the importance of the very bottom of many of my slides, especially the book titles in acronym format, and also chapter headings and page numbers for chapters or parts of them, especially if you decide that you want to pursue further research in these threads that I'm covering tonight, and especially also what happens when we take all these different threads and put them together and form a fuller picture. Thank you for being here tonight. Let's get started.
Bart, before you start the video, let me just say that John's presentation is pre-recorded, but we'll be following it with live Q&A. But let me give you a forewarning. It's about a 2-hour presentation. So if you need to start up your coffee machine, go ahead and do that. And the other thing I want to remind everybody is that there's 2 buttons you'll be dealing with. One is the chat button, and the other is the Q&A button. Chatting is obviously just discussion amongst yourselves. If you want to ask a question, you've got to use the Q&A, and that comes directly to me. And also keep in mind, our other policy is that your questions have to be limited to the program, the thesis, the talk that is being presented tonight. I know you might have questions about other things like the autopsy, the medical evidence. We're going to be getting into those. So please limit your questions to John on what he talks about tonight. And with that, Bart, we're ready to get going.
Let me begin with the title for my overall presentation this evening. JFK and the Cold War, Deception, Intrigue, and the Struggle for Power. This is part 1. The Kennedys, King, and the race issue, the election of 1960. Now, in popular wisdom, the shaping force in Dr. King's thinking was Mahatma Gandhi. However, it was the eminent American theologist Reinhold Niebuhr who fundamentally shaped King's religious views. Niebuhr's interest in Gandhi, however, was not lost on Dr. King. Niebuhr said this of Gandhi: his methods were a type of coercion offering the best chances for a strategic instrument for oppressed groups, unable to develop enough power to set against their oppressors. Now, the source of King's coercive nonviolent strategy was Niebuhr's book, Moral Man and Immoral Society. It was published in 1932, when King was just 3 years old. That work was the beginning of the end of classical liberalism in American theology. Niebuhr successfully attacked the social gospel's premise that the modern advance of reason could eliminate social evils. Niebuhr argued that there was no evidence that human beings became less predatory as they became better educated. Niebuhr was focused on coercive nonviolence. Nonviolent coercion and resistance, he said, is a type of coercion which offers the largest opportunities for a harmonious relationship with the moral and rational factors in social life. It doesn't destroy the process of a moral and rational adjustment of interests in the course of resistance. Significantly and interestingly, Niebuhr applied this strategy to the race issue in America. He said, however large the number of individual white men who will identify themselves completely with the Negro cause, the white race in America will not admit the Negro to equal rights if it is not forced to do so. Upon that point, one may speak with a dogmatism which all history justifies. Now let me turn to the subject of this part of my presentation, the 1960 election, and 14 days that changed history. There was a causal chain of 6 race-related events that led to JFK's November 1960 election. And each one of these events had to occur in order that the next event could take place. If any of these events had failed to take place, Kennedy would not have been elected president. There would have been no new frontier, no Keynesian economics, no increased minimum wage, no depressed area development, no proposals for Medicare and increased Social Security benefits, no Peace Corps and no Alliance for Progress. On the other hand, it's almost certain that America would have gone to war in Cuba, Laos, and in Vietnam. Now, the first of these 6 providential events that all happened at the right time in the right order was on 17 October, 1960. Kennedy had scuttled a proposed meeting with Dr. King after King said he would have to make a pro forma offer to meet with Nixon too. On 19 October, as a result of that, King was then available to participate in his first student sit-in in Atlanta, Georgia, where he was arrested. Now, this picture isn't one of what the sit-in that King was at, but it's typical, and it's hard to look at what they put themselves through. The next 2 events both occurred on the 26th of October. The first one at 3 a.m. in the morning. King found himself chained to the floor of a police car for hours as he was being transferred to another county, DeKalb County, to Reidsville Federal Penitentiary to be put on a chain gang. And all this was for an insignificant traffic violation. Later that day, the next event happened. At 10 o'clock in the morning, JFK made a sympathy call to Coretta King, to console her about Dr. King's terrible situation and offering to do whatever he could to help. The next event occurred on 27 October. Robert Kennedy made an angry call to Judge Mitchell and secured King's release on bail from Reidsville Penitentiary. The next day, on 28 October, the next event took place. The covert so-called Blue Bomb scheme was launched. Millions of pamphlets would be distributed to Black churches on Sunday, 6 November, 2 days before the election. Kennedy's campaign civil rights team carried out their scheme against Bobby Kennedy's orders. There were Harris Wofford, Lewis Martin, and Sergeant Shriver, and they violated, among other things, Bobby's gag order not to publicize JFK's call to Coretta King among the Black media. So the team took a daring gamble with time running out. The pamphlets titled, quote, "No Comment Nixon versus a Candidate with a Heart, Senator Kennedy," were published on cheap blue paper, earning the name the Blue Bomb. It took me many years to get an authentic copy, but this is one. This is exactly what it looked like, the Blue Bomb. And so at the last minute, MLK was able to endorse Kennedy. Out of prison, back in Atlanta just in time, Dr. King was free to add his thanks to JFK on the Blue Bomb. He said, quote, "I am deeply indebted to Senator Kennedy, who served as a great force in making my release possible. I am convinced he will seek to exercise the power of his office to fully implement the civil rights plank of his party's platform." And so the team continued to carry out their scheme against Bobby's orders. The pamphlets were shipped across the country on Greyhound buses from a dummy committee out of sight of the press and kept secret from the Kennedy brothers until after the election. Everywhere in the African-American community, the pamphlets were distributed outside of the churches after worship services. And then the amazing outcome, a come from behind win, surprise win. John F. Kennedy became the President of the United States. Then came the shocking election results themselves. Although the Electoral College was 303 to 219 for JFK, he won the popular vote by just 112,000 votes, a margin of 0.17%. But the single most amazing statistic about Kennedy's victory was his 40% margin among African-American voters. Now, in 1956, the previous election, the Black vote had split 60-40 for the Republican candidate. In 1960, the vote had split 70-30 for the Democratic candidate. This 30% shift produced victory margins for JFK in 7 key states: Michigan, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And then there was a bright light in the land. After winning the Democratic nomination, JFK had assembled 29 task force in domestic and foreign policy who would lead his administration after his victory in 1960. They would come into place, of course, after the inauguration in January 1961. JFK listened to Keynesian brain trusters like John Galbraith, Paul Samuelson, and Walter Heller. They sought to lower interest rates to spur the economy, running a surplus to fight inflation and a deficit to fight recession, and using the government instead of private enterprise to increase investment. The new frontier was for Main Street instead of Wall Street. And so the light of the new frontier included Medicaid, Medicare, increased Social Security benefits for the aged, minimum wage increases, low interest rates for small businesses. It also included unemployment insurance extensions, early payment of veterans' life insurance dividends, low-income housing, food surplus distribution, investment in natural resources, pollution control, watershed development, and in foreign policy, the Peace Corps, the Alliance for Progress, and above all, peace instead of war. And then the light faded. John Kennedy never thought that his vision for a better country, for all that he wanted to do to help Americans, and for all that he planned to do to bring peace to a world divided by the Cold War, that this vision could be threatened by the only part of the US government that he had let stay in place, the national security state, especially the CIA and the Pentagon and their plans for world hegemony. And then came the storm. JFK spent the last 3 years of his life struggling against those entrenched enablers of neocolonialism and economic exploitation of Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and the Far East. JFK's ship quickly ran into the crosswinds of domestic white racism and the righteous aspirations of African Americans and his inability to control the American national security state. And then came the darkness. Just when Kennedy realized that the truth was more important than his own political future, he spoke out in the summer of 1963 for civil rights and for peace instead of war in the Cold War. And then he was cut down. And so it would be also for his brother Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. They fought for civil rights and peace, and they all paid the ultimate price. All right, once again, my presentation is on JFK and the Cold War, deception, treachery and intrigue, and the struggle for power. This is part 2, the Cuban Cataclysm of 1961. We'll begin this section in the last year of the Eisenhower presidency in 1960. And as his covert action plan for Cuba developed, it turned into an assassination triple play. On 1 April 1960, CIA Chief Allen Dulles held a Cuban summit with CIA people and government and business leaders. And he opened up the meeting by saying that Castro had to be removed from power. The Nixon sycophant William Hawley was there, and he said he had been prepared to eliminate Castro for a price. The CIA memo after the meeting said Dulles jokingly remarked that he would turn this over to his assassination department. But Dulles' remark was removed in its entirety from the CIA summary of the meeting just 2 days later. Now, in that April meeting, DCI Dulles was making tough talk, but really he was not eager to step into the Stygian river of assassination. Dulles quickly found out that killing Castro was no joke. Eisenhower was already angry with him for not having reported the extent of Castro's communist ties back in 1959. And in March 1960, Eisenhower had approved a covert action plan to remove Castro. And in the fall of 1960, he would end up having to browbeat Dulles into directing assassinations of foreign heads of state. Now, later in 1960, Eisenhower ordered a larger plan to be put into place to overthrow Castro. He pressed for Castro's overthrow and chastised Dulles for proposing pointless sabotage operations. In an historic 18 August 1960 White House meeting on Cuba, President Eisenhower expanded the plan to get rid of Castro. And in a separate National Security Council session that same day, he ordered the assassination of Congo's Prime Minister Lumumba. This ruthless strategy became the unimaginable centerpiece of my Volume 2, Countdown to Darkness, a book that changed my view of President Eisenhower. Eisenhower's problem was that he had to get support from NATO and the Organization of American States for his plan to overthrow Castro to succeed. Now, this same president that warned us about the military-industrial complex wanted a triple Cold War assassination play. In search of support from the Organization of American States, Eisenhower perpetually pressured Dulles to get rid of Dominican President Rafael Trujillo. And in order to secure NATO support for his Cuban policy, Eisenhower ordered Dulles to arrange for the assassination of Congo's Prime Minister Lumumba. Now, Eisenhower's top secret triple assassination play turned out to be not so secret. He had ordered everyone, demanded that everyone had to swear he had not heard of it. But when John Kennedy learned during the campaign, learned about the CIA plan to invade Cuba, a brawl erupted over the Cuban crisis in the fall of 1960 during the Nixon-Kennedy presidential debates. JFK pummeled Nixon for not standing up to Castro and not arming the rebels inside and outside of the island. Actually, that's what the secret plan was doing. But Nixon was unable to respond due to Eisenhower's covert order on the nature of the plan. So I'd like to turn your attention now to the person in the CIA who was in charge of this covert plan, Deputy Director of Plans, Richard Bissell. He was desperate to keep the Cuban plan in play and ended up having to tell a big lie to JFK in order to do that. Bissell's problem was that this covert Cuban plan was dead on arrival. The Cuban exile groups in Miami and their sections inside of Cuba had long since descended into chaos. Soviet bloc weapons were pouring into Cuba as Castro easily quashed political dissent there. There would never be an uprising in Cuba, and the exile government would never be put ashore. The covert plan could not keep pace and breathed its last death gurgle in a 3 November special group meeting just 5 days before JFK was elected on 8 November. Now, the root of Bissell's problem was that the plan had always assumed that there would be an uprising on the island of Cuba. But in that 3 November meeting, the president's advisor, Gordon Gray, and the State and Defense Department representatives agreed that the covert activities originally envisaged by the CIA would no longer be effective. The special group admitted that a Cuban uprising would never happen. Gray suggested the possibility of using some of these CIA-backed exiles to mount a simulated, i.e. false flag attack on the American naval base at Guantanamo in order to offer an excuse for overt intervention. Also at this meeting, the group's proposal for planning the assassination of Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and Che Guevara was rejected by CIA Deputy Director Charles Cabell. Now, the election of John Kennedy on 8 November left the CIA with a huge dilemma. They would soon have to brief John Kennedy about the Cuban plan. And so at a 15 November CIA strategy session, they concocted 2 briefings for JFK. One admitting the truth that an exile invasion would never trigger an uprising, and a second briefing that left out this Rosetta Stone of an admission about the CIA Cuban plan. And so on 29 November in Palm Beach, Florida, Dulles and Bissell went down there to talk to John Kennedy, and Bissell had to brief him on the Cuban plan. And he told JFK that the planned uprising in Cuba would occur. A big lie. Everybody knew that that was never going to happen. Now, after the inauguration, the Joint Chiefs would have to take a position on the CIA's covert plan in Cuba. That ended up being the Bay of Pigs. The chiefs thought that JFK's tough talk at his inauguration speech meant that he was all about the overthrow of Castro, even with US forces. Things turned out differently. Lemnitzer ended up playing a shell game with the president, during which John Kennedy did not take the bait that Lemnitzer gave him, and then Lemnitzer had to pivot on the CIA's Cuban plan. So here's how that played out. The Chief of Staff, Chairman of the Chief of Staff, Lemnitzer, quickly realized that John Kennedy was against sending US forces into Cuba. Now, at first, Lemnitzer had told the truth about the exile invasion plan and had asked JFK who was going to help them when it failed. JFK twice refused on 25 and 28 January to take that bait and reveal his position against using US forces in Cuba. But he wasn't fooling anybody. Lemnitzer understood what Kennedy was up to. In order to prevent Kennedy from aborting the invasion, Lemnitzer reversed his position and said the CIA plan could succeed. Knowing that the plan was doomed, Lemnitzer's scheme was to let JFK do it his way, just to keep the plan alive, because they were certain that when the exiles were being slaughtered on the beachhead, President Kennedy would have to send in American combat forces. So the question is, why were the chiefs so certain that JFK would change his mind on Cuba? Well, the answer is about the situation in Laos, how the CIA handled JFK, and how he handled their proposal to send US combat troops into Laos. Once again, a big lie was necessary. That lie took place in late January when a false national intelligence estimate on Laos was put in front of Kennedy. Over the objections, by the way, in the meeting, over the national intelligence meeting, over the objections of Army intelligence, the CIA had issued a false NIE claiming that the US-backed forces in Laos could easily clear the communists from the Plain of Jars. So after JFK approved the plan in early March, guess what happened? Fumi's forces, the US-backed forces, threw down their rifles and ran away. So in a 15 March press conference, a sullen Kennedy had to explain what was happening in Laos. It was his first real embarrassment. What had happened during the transition between Eisenhower and Kennedy, and of course, this is our weak spot, and our enemies have understood this over the years and tried to use that, take advantage of that in between the election and the inauguration to do things And then here, what you're looking at is a huge Soviet airlift from North Vietnam of North Vietnamese forces down into the Plain of Jars, basically taking over most of the country of Laos. And so JFK blinked on Laos. Now, the Soviet response was a massive support for the communist Pathet Lao forces to begin overrunning all of Laos during the last 2 weeks of March 1961 as the Bay of Pigs approached. Now, after the fall of the USSR in 1991, former Soviet sources revealed what Khrushchev and his KB chief Shlepin had been planning at that time in 1961. Moscow was pressuring for a US commitment in Laos to disperse US forces and tie them down so that West Berlin would fall into the Soviet camp. And so on 23 March, JFK decided that it was time to get ready. He announced that 3 aircraft carriers with 1,400 Marines were sent to the South China Sea, and 2,600 more Marines were made ready in Okinawa, along with a large commitment of American air assets. So the chiefs saw JFK blink on Laos. And that is why they were so sure he would blink on Cuba when the exile invasion failed. But the chiefs had miscalculated. The timing wasn't good for them because the Bay of Pigs was going to happen before Kennedy made up his mind on Laos. As JFK waited for the outcome in Cuba, he didn't give the go signal for Laos. So Leominster discovered just how wrong he had been when he confronted Kennedy in the White House as the battle raged on the beachhead in Cuba. Kennedy wasn't going to buy it. He was not going to send in the troops. So the Bay of Pigs fiasco quickly caused JFK to decide against US military intervention in Laos. So the outcome was they got neither. They didn't get Cuba and they didn't get Laos. Now, I want to talk just briefly about the personal and obviously bad motives of the CIA chief Dulles and his deputy Bissell in this Cuban fiasco. I'll start with Bissell. In February, he was offered an undersecretary position high up in the State Department. But Kennedy told him not to accept it because he was going to make him the new DCI, replacing Dulles in July. So Bissell, in charge of an invasion plan that he knew would fail, he knew he needed a Hail Mary. So he told Bill Harvey, who was head of Section D, which was a super secret component of the CIA at the time, that the Kennedys wanted an assassination capability in the CIA. That was a bald lie, but Harvey knew about it. Harvey knew that he was in charge of such an assassination unit. But what was going on is Bissell was pressuring Harvey to kill Castro quickly by saying the Kennedys wanted him dead. So bottom line is Bissell desperately wanted to become the new head of the CIA. And so he pressured Harvey to kill Castro quickly in order to do that, made up a false story saying that the Kennedy brothers wanted such a capability and wanted that to happen. And that was a lie. Now, on the other hand, there are the motives of Allen Dulles. Like the Joint Chiefs, Dulles was counting on the failure of the invasion plan too, and hoped that JFK would have to put in US forces. But his scheme was to save his own skin. During the invasion, Dulles took a vacation with his wife. Wasn't even around. He left Bissell holding the bag for the failure. Dulles knew that Kennedy intended to appoint Bissell as his replacement, and he was willing to let men die on the beachhead in order to keep his job as the director of Central Intelligence. And finally, we need to mention what JFK's bottom line was in all these affairs, and all these events. He was unwilling to intervene with US military forces in Cuba or Southeast Asia, but he was willing to fight for West Berlin. And he knew that putting US forces in these places, Southeast Asia, or Cuba would jeopardize the future of West Berlin. While JFK was right about that, he would find out in June that the Bay of Pigs failure had emboldened Khrushchev to push the West out of Berlin. Now I want to pause here at the end just to make a comment about the real teaching point that I believe comes out of all this. There's been much ink spilled on the changing the Bay of Pigs landing locales, calling off airstrikes, and these matters, but we too often lose sight of what it means, whether we're civilian or military senior officers, that we need to carry out our duties honorably. My favorite Army intelligence officer is Major General Joseph McChristian. During the Westmoreland trial in the mid-60s on his lies on Vietnam, McChristian, who had been his chief of staff of intelligence, always told the truth and ended up getting fired by Westmoreland. But anyway, during that trial, McChristian was asked a question. What does it mean to lie about the enemy in a time of war? And his answer, it threatens not only the lives of the soldiers on the battlefield, but also the future liberty of our people at home. Now that's my kind of general. As I mentioned a moment ago, the American failure at the Bay of Pigs emboldened Khrushchev to try to push the West out of Berlin. And so now I turn to part 3, the 1961 Berlin crisis, the most dangerous place on earth. Europe was the center of the Cold War chessboard. And West Berlin was at the center square of that chessboard. The transition of East and West Germany from the 4 Allied occupation zones in 1949 left West Berlin exposed 110 miles inside of East Germany. As the Cold War conflict unfolded, the city of West Berlin became a perpetual point of infernal danger. West Berlin, a lonely pawn at the center of the board, anchored the Cold War in dangerous conflict and reciprocal hostility that would grip the world for the next 3 decades. Dividing Germany, the first step in Khrushchev's plan to get rid of the ulcer of West Berlin. In 1958, Khrushchev had demanded a German peace treaty to permanently legitimize the division of Germany. That demand remained when the Paris Eisenhower-Khrushchev Summit Conference exploded in May 1960. And it would become the focal point of Khrushchev's secret scheme for testing the newly elected 44-year-old American president and removing the ulcer of West Berlin. The first aftershock of the Bay of Pigs fiasco was Kennedy's decision not to invade Laos. The second aftershock was Khrushchev's decision to test Kennedy on West Berlin. Khrushchev's plans to ambush Kennedy at the Vienna summit. In early March 1961, Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed to have a summit meeting in Vienna. In March, KGB chief Shelepin told Khrushchev that the US was preparing to blockade Cuba and intervene there with US forces. When the Cuban brigade landed at the Bay of Pigs, Khrushchev warned JFK a new conflagration might erupt elsewhere, i.e. Berlin. Khrushchev took the Bay of Pigs failure as a sign of JFK's weakness and inexperience. The Vienna summit would become a Soviet snare. The June 1961 Vienna summit. The 3 June discussion in the American ambassador's office was a preliminary sparring match by both leaders. But during the 4 June meeting, Khrushchev said, quote, "Berlin is the most dangerous place in the world. The USSR wants to perform an operation on this soft spot to eliminate this thorn, this ulcer." Khrushchev confronted JFK with a bombshell. The USSR planned to sign a peace treaty with East Germany, after which all rights of Western access to Berlin will expire. Khrushchev said, "I want peace, but if you want war, that is your problem." JFK replied, "It is you, not I, who wants to force a change." And as they parted, Kennedy remarked, "It will be a cold winter." The decision to build the Berlin Wall. In July 1961, the refugee outflow from East to West Berlin rose to 1,000 educated, mostly educated and technically trained people every day. Khrushchev then decided to build the Berlin Wall. Super secret handwritten progress reports were forwarded to Moscow via courier. No telephone or radio transmissions were permitted. On 13 August, barricades sealed off the crossing points to West Berlin. In the next few weeks, a formidable, heavily fortified, guarded, and booby-trapped cement barrier was erected. JFK thought privately that the border closure was a good turning point. He said, "It's not a very nice solution, but a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war." But at that point, JFK drew a line in the sand over West Berlin. JFK's July 1961 warning on Berlin. By the summer of 1961, the Berlin crisis had evolved into the most dangerous flashpoint for nuclear conflict since the onset of the Cold War. In a 25 July 1961 televised address, JFK warned that the immediate threat to world freedom was in West Berlin. He said Soviet ambitions now meet in basic confrontation over Berlin. Quote, "The showcase of liberty and great testing place of Western courage and will since 1945. And so the Berlin crisis escalated. On 22 August, the Soviet Union threatened Western air corridors to Berlin. Access to East Berlin was cut to one crossing point, Checkpoint Charlie. The Allies quickly deployed 1,000 troops, backed by 10 tanks, at the wall in defiance of the imposition of a 100-meter standoff rule. On 31 August, the Soviets deployed tanks in all towns close to the border. And on 23 September, the US 7th Army was placed on alert. 2 days later, Kennedy reaffirmed the United States' resolve to defend West Berlin. And at this point, President Kennedy decided to lay down his trump cards on the table for everybody to see, revealing US nuclear superiority. On 21 October, the president ordered Deputy Secretary of Defense Kilpatrick to give a speech in Hot Springs, West Virginia, to some business people, revealing that the US had 600 heavy bombers, 6 Polaris submarines with 96 missiles, dozens of intercontinental ballistic missiles, and large carrier strike forces, totaling tens of thousands of nuclear delivery vehicles with multiple warheads. This was the final death gurgle of the alleged Soviet ICBM lead and a concomitant public display of overwhelming American superiority in the strategic nuclear balance of power. Although the game continued, at the secret level, it was really over. On 25 October 1961, US tanks moved into West Berlin, and for the first time in years, 33 Soviet manned tanks, accompanied by troops, entered the city limits of East Berlin. For the first time during the Cold War, both sides ended up with 10 tanks with engines running, facing each other at Checkpoint Charlie. A standoff at Checkpoint Charlie occurred. The American tanks with bulldozer blades were conspicuously shown, while American helicopters buzzed over the checkpoint, ignoring East German and Soviet protests. What was really going on is shown by new evidence that Khrushchev was in a situation he did not want to be in. His decision to put Soviet armor in East Berlin was actually an attempt to claw back control of the crisis from the aggressive East Germans. On the brink of war over West Berlin, the standoff lasted for 16 long hours when Moscow was aware that 4 US missile-firing atomic Polaris submarines were submerged in the North Sea, each with 16 warheads aimed at targets in the Soviet Union. At Checkpoint Charlie, the Soviet Guard Post was talking through the Soviet High Command to Khrushchev. The US Guard Post was communicating through the US military in Berlin to President Kennedy. The Kennedy-Khrushchev back channel. President Kennedy asked General Clay, his emissary in the guardhouse, the American guardhouse at Checkpoint Charlie, if he was nervous. Nervous? No, we're not nervous here, Clay answered. If anybody's nervous, Mr. President, it will probably be people in Washington. JFK, with his feet up on his desk during the call, said, well, there may be a lot of nervous people around here, but I'm not one of them. General Clay didn't know that Bobby Kennedy was talking with his friend and USSR intelligence contact, Bolshakov, during the tank stand confrontation that occurred at Checkpoint Charlie. Within hours, JFK and Khrushchev were messaging through RFK and Bolshakov. How cooler heads prevailed. On 26 October, Kennedy offered to go easy over Berlin in the future if the Soviets removed their tanks first. Khrushchev later revealed, I assured my comrades that as soon as we pulled back our tanks, the Americans will pull back their tanks within 20 minutes. After the Soviet tanks pulled back, Khrushchev reported, just as I expected, it did take only 20 minutes for the Americans to respond. And with that choreographed scene, the 1961 Berlin crisis ended. And what can we take away from this event? Well, Kennedy had misjudged Khrushchev, and Khrushchev had misjudged Kennedy. In the end, nuclear war was averted when both leaders worked through a back channel instead of through their subordinates. And then Khrushchev soon realized he had to make a desperate decision. Outgunned and surrounded by American power, Khrushchev realized that there was only one way that he could get leverage to level the imbalance of strategic nuclear power: by deploying medium and intermediate range Soviet missiles in Cuba. All right, I'll move along now to the second half of my presentation. It consists of parts 4, 5, and 6 that deal with Vietnam and Cuba. First up will be part 4. The Vietnam War from 1961 to May 1962, when the big lie started. This is the worst one we've got, isn't it? President Kennedy said after reading a very troubling report on Vietnam just 6 days after his inauguration. That report was written by this guy, General Edward Lansdale. He wanted to be the US ambassador to South Vietnam, but he would never be stationed in Vietnam until JFK was no longer in the White House. I want to mention the Laos Annex to the Vietnam Task Force report that was issued on April the 27th, 1961. As I said in part 3 of my presentation this evening, by 27 April 1961, the Pentagon knew JFK would never intervene in Laos. And that night, the Pentagon inserted an annex into the Vietnam Task Force report. Authored by Lansdale, it was the first document ever to recommend sending US troops to Vietnam. Lansdale knew that Secretary of State Rusk had killed his dream of becoming the US ambassador to South Vietnam. But Lansdale was betting that the star rising on the horizon was intervention in Vietnam, and he would be correct, and he intended to be there when it happened. Just 2 weeks before Lansdale authored that annex to the Vietnam Task Force report, on April 1st, 61, Deputy Secretary of Defense Roswell Gilpatrick warned that the situation in South Vietnam was critical. He said the number of hardcore Viet Cong communists, VC, had tripled from 4,400 in early 1960 to 12,000 in April of 1961. Gilpatrick said Viet Cong forces were approaching the point where South Vietnam's army would be unable to cope. And he said 3,000 more Viet Cong had infiltrated through Laos on the Ho Chi Minh Trail into Vietnam since March 1961. From May through October 1961, President Kennedy was inundated with nonstop calls to send US combat troops to Vietnam. The struggle that erupted over combat troops in April continued unabated and parallel to the concomitant nuclear-tinged Berlin crisis and with growing domestic racial unrest in America. President Kennedy pushed aside all the calls from the Joint Chiefs of Staff to send combat troops. Upset by the intense pressure to intervene, JFK decided he had to act. So in October, he sent General Maxwell Taylor, his military advisor, to Vietnam, and JFK ordered him to return with a recommendation against sending US combat troops to Vietnam. But when Taylor returned, Kennedy wasn't happy. Taylor returned with a strange proposal to send 8,000 US combat troops to Vietnam under a, quote, flood release task force cover. Shocked and angry, President Kennedy tried to recall all copies of the final report. JFK even planted false stories in the papers that implied Taylor had not endorsed sending US combat troops. One result of Taylor's proposal was that JFK would cross swords with General Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. For President Kennedy, Taylor's proposal was the last straw. In the intense debate that followed, the key meeting occurred on 15 November 1961. The president asked Lemnitzer how he could justify this proposal for Vietnam while at the same time ignoring Cuba. Lemnitzer bluntly and even impudently replied that the Joint Chiefs still felt that even at this point, the US should go into Cuba. National Security Action Memorandum 111. On 22 November 1961, JFK drew a line in the sand on Vietnam with NSAM 111, pictured here. It contained no combat troops and no guarantees to save Vietnam from communism. President Kennedy did agree to a significant increase in American advisors and equipment, but he would not go beyond this commitment at any point during the rest of his presidency. So what was behind Kennedy's astute judgment in the issuing of NSAM 111? Well, we know from the Berlin crisis that JFK was willing to go to war for the right reason in Berlin, and that for him getting mired in Vietnam could trigger a much bigger war in Europe. So Kennedy turned down combat troops in Vietnam, not when his decision was clouded by ambiguities and contradictions in the reports from the battlefield, but when the battle was unequivocally desperate, when all concerned agreed that Vietnam's fate hung in the balance, and when his principal advisors told him that vital US interests in the region and the world were at stake. President Kennedy's Thanksgiving massacre over Vietnam policy. 3 days after Thanksgiving on 26 November, President Kennedy shook up the State Department to kneecap those promoting intervention in Vietnam. The next day, on 27 November, JFK invited Allen Dulles on his last day as the Director of Central Intelligence to the White House to witness another shakeup over Vietnam policy, I'll get to that one shortly. Later that same day, on 27 November, the president gave a short speech to a small swearing-in ceremony for the new director of Central Intelligence, John McCone. JFK concluded with this remark: "We want to welcome you here and to say that you are now living on the bullseye, and I welcome you to that spot." Still on November 61, after those personnel purges, JFK laid down the law in Vietnam. An unusual group of officials were called to another meeting in the White House, some who had been fired and some who were their replacements. Once JFK entered the room, he vented his frustration over the lack of support for his Vietnam policy. JFK declared, quote, "Once policy is decided, people on the spot must support it or get out." And the president demanded to know who in the Pentagon would be personally responsible for implementing his program. Secretary of Defense McNamara answered, "Myself and L," meaning Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs. McNamara takes charge. That very night, McNamara returned to the Pentagon to lay out the plan for what he called Operation Beef Up, many military actions to boost the war effort in South Vietnam. On 16 December, at his first Secretary of Defense SecDef conference, he set forth 3 tenets. First, we have great authority from President Kennedy. Second, money is no object. Third, no combat troops will be sent to Vietnam. The Military Assistance Command, MACV, was created as a subordinate command of the Commander-in-Chief Pacific, CINCPAC. General Maxwell Taylor's old friend and protege, General Paul D. Harkins, became the first MACV commander on the 2nd of January, 1962. A few days later, Lemnitzer sent his most audacious memorandum to President Kennedy. On 13 January 62, McNamara sent the memo to JFK saying he didn't endorse it. It was a long, insubordinate diatribe that was essentially saying this: "We told you a year ago to send combat troops to Vietnam, but you didn't listen. We've done everything you asked for in your program, and if it falls apart, we still want to send in combat troops. And if you fail to do it then, it will only make our job more difficult when we have to do it anyway." There was alarming news about the Viet Cong forces surging at the second SecDef conference on 15 January. 2 days after Lemnitzer's demeaning dig at President Kennedy, the review of the enemy situation at the second SecDef conference revealed that hardcore Viet Cong strength had risen to 20,000 or 25,000. Now, U.S. counterinsurgency doctrine then and now holds that a minimum 10-to-1 ratio is required to contain an insurgency: 5 soldiers in static defense for cities and infrastructure, and a minimum of 5-to-1 in the offense. Thus, with just 160,000 men in South Vietnam's army, it could only contain a Viet Cong force of 16,000. A VC force of 25,000 men required an army of 250,000 men just to contain them. The third SecDef conference on 19 February 62, yet another controversy over the Viet Cong. This time, their numbers happened. Colonel Winterbottom, who was the head of intelligence at MACV, showed several slides on Viet Cong strength ranging from 18,000 to 27,000. Lemnitzer piped up and said, "It makes it look like we're losing." But when McNamara asked why there was such a discrepancy, Colonel Winterbottom replied that the analysis personnel lacked the required training. Almost falling out of his chair with anger, Lemnitzer scolded Winterbottom for this assertion. But his patience at its end, Secretary of Defense McNamara demanded a requirements list and declared this intelligence problem must be solved. And at this point, what happened was a sudden reversal in military reporting on the war in Vietnam. What I call the beginning of the optimistic interlude. Our first clue about this also occurred at the Third SecDef conference by the MACV commander, General Harkins. In the order of battle uproar that had taken place, scant attention was paid to General Harkins' surprising opening remarks about a spirit of optimism and growing confidence in Vietnamese and US military and civilian circles. McNamara and others passed on this rosy news to House Appropriations and Foreign Relations Committees on Capitol Hill when he got back. But this early optimism was still in stark contrast to the conclusions of US intelligence community estimates. How could it be that there was optimism at this point? It was only a month since Lemnitzer had told President Kennedy that nothing short of 6 US combat divisions in Vietnam could prevent a communist takeover from New Delhi to Tokyo, not just Vietnam. In Vietnam, very few of the new American advisors had even arrived in country yet. And even those were still awaiting assignments. And it was long before President Kennedy's new program had any chance to affect the tide of battle in Vietnam. So what was it? What we do know is that this new optimistic interlude would not end until 20 November 1963, 2 days before the assassination of President Kennedy. So MACV analysts were augmented by the best military and civilian experts on Vietnamese order battle issues in the world to prepare to brief McNamara of what he wanted the intelligence problem to be solved. That would take place from 8 to 11 May 1962 at the 5th SecDef conference in Saigon. For 6 weeks, the order of battle team had crawled across Vietnam's 44 provinces and found there were 40,000 or more Viet Cong, hardcore Viet Cong, to report to McNamara at the conference in Saigon. The briefing that took place in front of him falsely claimed there were only 16,500 hardcore Viet Cong. The exact number, of course, that the 170,000 man South Vietnam Army would be able to handle. But not only were the forces cut by that stark amount, but the briefing also falsely claimed that the South Vietnamese Army was crushing the Viet Cong on the battlefield. Afterward, McNamara, on the tarmac at the airport, said he was tremendously encouraged and that every quantitative assessment shows that we are winning the war. For the next several slides, we will take a look at the truth about the war in Vietnam and why that truth only made it through a secret back channel to Vice President Lyndon Johnson, not to McNamara and Kennedy. From the moment General Harkins, the MACV commander, lied about how swimmingly things were going at the Third SecDef conference, a covert scheme to hide the truth about the war from JFK had been put into play. This secret back channel memo from LBJ's military aide, Colonel Howard Burris, shows that growing Viet Cong battalion echelon attacks were underway. In mid-February, a false stream of data on the numbers of hardcore Viet Cong began flowing to JFK through McNamara, while a truthful stream of data flowed to Vice President Johnson through his aide Burris. The motive behind the false story was to prevent President Kennedy from pulling out of Vietnam early. In 1991, Burris told me in an interview that Lyndon Baines Johnson told him to find out what the hell was going on. But LBJ never mentioned this seditious activity in his memoirs or any other public venue. At this time, the president and the Secretary of Defense, McNamara, were consumed by the struggle with Lemnitzer over Cuba. We'll get to that in the next presentation, part 5. So McNamara and JFK were asleep at the switch at this point on the Vietnam misdirection campaign. This March 1962 extract, pictured here from a Burris memorandum, is full of clues about what was going on. McNamara didn't know what Burris was up to. Well, Burris knew all about McNamara's meetings. Burris had been talking with the Joint Staff and with General Taylor's office. This suggests General Taylor knew about the false info being fed to JFK and did not tell him about it either. Burris's marginalia in this March 62 memo suggests that McNamara was not sure what was really going on. McNamara thought he could get some answers at the conferences, but the answers were fabrications. What this handwriting says is in Burris is writing this to LBJ. This same question of where we are in South Vietnam still disturbs Mr. McNamara. He's leaving today, March 20th, for meetings in Honolulu, where he hopes to get some answers. Yeah, well, he got answers all right, fabrications. McNamara and JFK, as I said before, were distracted by the growing power struggle over Cuba. As we're leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. One thing was certain. Burris was making sure that LBJ had the latest true information on the deception of JFK about the battlefield situation in Vietnam. As McNamara waited for the upcoming account to him of the size of the Viet Cong, they were rapidly increasing the intensity of their attacks. This March 1962 secret Burris memo to LBJ reveals that the monthly losses sustained by the South Vietnamese army were staggering. The Viet Cong were now challenging regular units of South Vietnamese army in the field. When I interviewed Burris in 1991 and asked him where he got his information, he hinted that it was from US Army intelligence. And this slide is proof that he's right about that, at least partially. Burris had access to secret US Army Pacific intelligence bulletins. USARPAC was underneath the command of CINCPAC, Commander-in-Chief Pacific. On the left of your screen, you see the USARPAC monthly intelligence bulletins. And on the right side of the screen, you're seeing a 16 April memo from Burris to the Vice President. And they have exactly the same figures down to the nth degree. USARPAC raw data was coming from United States Army intelligence units in Vietnam. And they were saying in March 62 that there were 1,861 Viet Cong attacks. And the same exact figure was used in Burris's April 16th memo to LBJ. At no other place do you find these exact figures. They were released, by the way, to me when I made a request to the Army Center for Military History. That's why it says the Newman Papers. They're all now stored up in the JFK Library. In the picture, in the front of that picture is Don Blasek. He was a librarian, retired at the time, at the Army Military Intelligence School in Arizona, where I was attending the Military Intelligence Advanced Course in 1988. When we met, and he discovered that my PhD dissertation was on JFK in Vietnam, he told me about how the Vietnam order of battle had been completely corrupted in 1962. He said, that's when the big lie started. He was there when it happened. And he gave me the names of the officers who were forced to cut the figures by General Harkins and Colonel Winterbottom. Don Blasek also said that a former CI officer in Virginia, living in Virginia, Sam Adams, would tell me how to contact them. When I returned to the National Security Agency for my next assignment, I had a long visit with Sam Adams on his farm, Loudon Farm in Virginia. Later, in the mid-1960s, Sam Adams was the one who discovered that MACV was lying This is under the when Westmoreland was there in 65, 6, and 7. McVie was lying about the size of the Viet Cong then. That's why Blasek told me that 1962 was when the big lie got started. In 1988, when I had my interview with Adams, he told me that two experienced order of battle specialists named George Allen and Bill Benedict were sent to Saigon after after McNamara ordered McVie to find out the actual size of the Viet Cong. Now, the results of their 6 weeks of work I mentioned before were not presented to McNamara at the May 62 SecDef conference. Their VC strength figures were drastically cut, and Allen and Benedict were kept under house arrest until McNamara had been briefed and had left Saigon. Now, the nice gentleman who gave me the USAPEC intelligence summaries asked me if I also wanted him to declassify the so-called measles map. I hadn't heard of that yet. Anyway, the measles map was shown to McNamara during the 11th May briefing. Of course, I said yes. Although McVie had cut most of the VC units, they had forgotten to change what you're looking at here, which was on a 4x8 plywood display made by Benedict and Allen. The night before McNamara's briefing, there was a command rehearsal. And when they walked in, Harkins saw this map and he exclaimed, "Oh my God, we can't show that to McNamara." And in front of the McVie senior officers in this rehearsal, Harkins directed Winterbottom peel off the scariest overlays of Viet Cong force locations. And what you're looking at is the falsified version of the measles. It already looks pretty bad here, but it was much worse. And I will have to tell you that this has been confirmed by other people that I met at NSA. The NSA representative there saw that. He was present. He saw what they did. And others have talked about it too, including a CIA chief of intelligence, director of the CIA told me the same story because he was there at the time. And so here you can see picture the actual portion of the report given to McNamara during that conference, the brief from the briefing book. McVie cut VC forces from over 40,000 to just 16,000 and hatched a huge lie about the battlefield situation. General Harkins showed South Vietnam data for 6 weeks from 21 March to 7 May, but he only showed the Viet Cong data for 3 weeks from 14 April to 7 May. Now you don't have to get your slide rule out, but you would need to look at this slide a couple of times to see what's missing. The missing Viet Cong data from 21 March to 14 April was a countrywide and the largest offensive, Viet Cong offensive of the war to date, which is why it's missing from here. From 14 April to 7 May, the Viet Cong were regrouping to replace their dead and wounded and to refit their forces with new weapons. And why? Because here is from the USAPEC intelligence bulletins. This is a map of that period leading up to McNamara's SecDef conference in May. And this is what was missing, but they didn't show him. And if you look at it, just about all those spots along the map there, all of them are battalion size Viet Cong attacks. And where are they attacking? Not just one place, but the length and the breadth of the entirety of South Vietnam, and especially around Saigon and the Delta below. I found an interview with Allen and Benedict in 1998. They had never seen or talked to each other since 1962. When they confirmed everything that Adams and Blasek told me, I knew I had the Army to release these monthly intelligence bulletins. And they did, as you can see here, what Harkins hid from McNamara, the enormous Viet Cong offensive that ended just 3 weeks before McNamara's briefing in Saigon. Now, I want to end this section by stating that the myth of battlefield success in Vietnam was manufactured to prevent JFK from pulling out of Vietnam. But remember, as we'll see in the next part coming up, at the same time all this was going on, in March and April of 1962, General Lemnitzer was trying to push Kennedy into a war in Cuba, where the USSR was preparing to introduce offensive nuclear missiles. Well, this brings me to part 5, the place in mid-1962, at the end of volume 3, Into the Storm, where I had to pull down the curtain for an intermission before moving on to volume 4, Armageddon. That was 27 months ago. In that time, and the rest of this year, there have been many surprises, and there will be more. Part 5, Shipwreck in Cuba. How Generals Lemnitzer and Lansdale conspired to subvert Operation Mongoose, turn it into Operation Northwoods, and force Kennedy into a war on Cuba. I'll devote the first half of this part to the shipwreck in Cuba, and the second half on how that helped set the stage for Kennedy's assassination over a year later. My volume 3, Into the Storm, was the beginning of a journey through events that really happened in 1962. I refer to them as a shipwreck. Might have been the end of the world. Our journey is blocked by false signposts to roads that lead all journeymen to dead ends. Some of those roadblocks were created in 1961 and 1962, and some were created in the years that followed, some many years later, in the 70s. In volume 4, Armageddon, I hope to expose those false paths so that our journey into 1962 and 1963 is unshackled from the detritus of deception. In 2017, former House Select Committee investigator Dan Hardaway asked me to closely examine one of those false paths, the claims of Antonio Veciana. I won't be discussing Antonio Veciana in my presentation this evening. My latest presentation on him in November of 2020 is available at my website, jfkjmn.com. The Veciana story is still unfolding. Many FOIAs and lawsuits that I've initiated are pending. Operation Mongoose, an unfortunate new attempt of the Kennedy brothers to overthrow Castro. As it began the end of 1961 and early 62, JFK was still purging the Central Intelligence Agency and the Pentagon of people that wouldn't follow his directions. As I mentioned before, on 27 November 1961, Allen Dulles' last day as the Director of Central Intelligence, President Kennedy gave a brief speech at the swearing in of McComb, the new Director of Central Intelligence, and said, "We want to welcome you here and to say that you are now living on the bullseye. And I welcome you to that spot." That comment wasn't lost on anybody. On 31 January 1962, Kennedy fired the Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, Charles Cabell. In February, the Deputy Director of Plans, the covert side of the CIA, Dick Bissell, was removed and replaced by Richard Helms. Having steered clear of the Vietnam trap, nuclear-tinged crises in Laos and Berlin, in December 1961, the Kennedy brothers sailed unwisely again into the hazardous waters of Cuba to overthrow Fidel Castro. JFK's Operation Mongoose plan sought to achieve this, quote, short of outright war. The one thing that was off limits was military invasion, unquote. And so that produced a power struggle between President Kennedy and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Lemnitzer, and his allies. In February 1962, a seditious plot was put into play in the Pentagon. General Lemnitzer began covertly preparing officers in the Joint Staff's J1, manpower and personnel, the J2, intelligence, J3, operations, and J4, logistics, to invade Cuba against Kennedy's explicit orders. In December 1961, the Kennedy brothers appointed Assistant Secretary of Defense Lansdale as the Mongoose operations chief. but Lansdale would become a secret, for a while, stalking horse for Lemnitzer. In late January 1962, Lansdale began secretly working with Lemnitzer on a false flag pretext operation by front-loading into Mongoose's several tasks, those that were ostensibly tasks for JFK Operation Mongoose, front-loading the Lemnitzer program for Operation Northwoods. In February, John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy discovered this and kneecapped Lansdale to force Lemnitzer into the open. And so, in mid-March, General Lemnitzer unveiled his Operation Northwoods plan for the US to attack itself and blame Castro to create a pretext for an American invasion. During a 16-March face-to-face confrontation at which Lansdale was present, JFK bluntly shot down Lemnitzer's plan, his Northwoods plan. On 3 April 1962, President Kennedy appointed Army General Marshall Carter as the new Deputy Director of Central Intelligence. Having served as the commanding general of the Army Air Defense Center in Chicago in 1961 and 1962, General Carter was an expert on missiles and air defense. He was also a longtime friend and protege of General Lemnitzer. Both Lemnitzer and Carter had close ties to the National Security Agency and its super secret spying capabilities. Operation Mongoose and the two worst decisions of JFK's presidency. John Kennedy's worst decision of his presidency was Mongoose, an attempt to get even with Castro that would end in disaster. Lemnitzer, facing the end of his term as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in mid-62 and facing forced Army retirement in August 1963, reacted to JFK's rebuke of Northwoods with disrespect, and on 10 April recommended invading Cuba anyway, without any pretext. In May, President Kennedy made the second worst decision of his presidency by offering to extend Lemnitzer's time on active duty as the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe and appointing General Taylor as the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. JFK did not understand the danger of appointing Lemnitzer as the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, nor did he suspect that his military aide Taylor, upon becoming the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, would eventually betray his Vietnam policy during the months before his assassination. In part two of my presentation this evening, we saw the Dulles-Lemnitzer collaboration leading up to the Bay of Pigs in early 1961 to force President Kennedy into a war in Cuba. And I just went over a few moments ago Lemnitzer's failed attempt to manipulate JFK into a war in Cuba in 1962. I now want to take you back 17 years to a point just before the end of World War II, when once again, we find Allen Dulles and Lemnitzer colluding, this time behind President Roosevelt's back. In the spring of 1945, Roosevelt declared that after World War II, German war power had to be ended completely, but the British planned to shift Germany into action against Russia. Roosevelt's stance shocked Churchill, and at the urging of his British mentor, Harold Alexander, Lemnitzer was sent to join Dulles, not DCI then, but he's in Switzerland, to undermine FDR's plans. With General Karl Wolff, head of the Nazi SS forces in Italy, Dulles and Lemnitzer secretly hammered out Operation Sunrise, a separate peace with Germany, allowing the redeployment of German assets against Russia while keeping Roosevelt in the dark. At this time, Allen Dulles was working in the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, in Switzerland. He would become the Director of Central Intelligence in 1951. Now, this Dulles-Lemnitzer collaboration back in 1945 set the stage for one of the darkest, unethical, an ill-fated evolution of covert operations under NATO's direction, Operation Gladio. I want to discuss that now, and I'll be doing that about the next 9 slides. Shortly after World War II, the United States and Great Britain set up secret so-called Gladio armies. Gladio is a sword used by Greek soldiers. Secret Gladio armies in Western Europe after World War II to counter a probable Soviet military invasion. So the Gladio stay-behind armies were to be activated after a Soviet military occupation of all of Western Europe. But during the Cold War, Gladio became NATO's clandestine operational arm and employed a strategy of tension, assassinations, social violence, and prefabricated false flag chaos to disrupt the political aspirations of socialist and communist parties in the countries of Europe. Staffed by right-wing terror groups, former Nazis, and Mussolini fascists, these terrorist paramilitary units were very active when President Kennedy unknowingly gave Lemnitzer control over them by appointing him as the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe in 1962. Lemnitzer was well informed about the secret Gladio armies, while in Western Europe, the SACEUR, always a US officer, supervised the secret armies through NATO's Clandestine Planning Committee, the CPC, and NATO's Allied Clandestine Committee, the ACC. In interesting ways, General Lemnitzer had been connected to the creation of these secret military units. In 1948, he was the Secretary of Defense Forrestal's emissary to the Five Powers Military Committee that eventually produced NATO. In 1949 to 1950, Lemnitzer was in charge of providing weapons to Europe. Many of them were hidden in Gladio's underground stay-behind caches. The secret Gladio units spread across Scandinavia, Europe, and into Turkey under the secret anti-communist NATO protocols. These stay-behind units were created by the Central Intelligence Agency and Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, with help from other security services in Western Europe. They were equipped with machine guns, explosives, munitions, and high-tech communication equipment hidden in forests, meadows, and underground bunkers all across Western Europe. Gladio and its history are still an official secret. The US and UK have never openly admitted that they funded these secret armies to use sabotage and assassination to impede European domestic politics. But in the 1990s, Washington's and London's darkest secret was finally exposed. After his retirement, the CIA station chief from 1949 to the mid-1950s in Frankfurt, Germany, Thomas Polgar, spoke openly about the scandal. Polgar said the secret Gladio units were coordinated by a, quote, unconventional warfare planning group linked to NATO, which was a reference to the Allied clandestine committees I mentioned earlier, the CPC and the ACC. In Italy in 1956, Licio Gelli became a director of Permindex, a CIA front organization under Frank Wisner, who managed Gladio units that supplied arms to Nagy's rebel forces in Hungary. In 1959 in Italy, the Gladio stay-behind units there evolved into covert Masonic lodges that popped up on NATO bases and became mafia magnets that contacted American Masons who funded the fight against the Red Menace in Europe. After having been fired by Bobby Kennedy in the summer of 1962, in 1963, CIA Rome Station Chief William Harvey endorsed a strategy of tension, political, psychological, and paramilitary, to diminish the power of the Italian Communist Party by intimidation and false flag operations. Staving off communist leanings in Italy and Turkey was crucial to US Cold War nuclear strategy, where those were two countries where the United States had supplied lots of Jupiter missiles aimed at the USSR. In 1960 in Turkey, Gladio units had staged a coup d'etat against Prime Minister Menderes, who had asked for economic aid from the Soviet Union, and they executed him. On 18 September 1962, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Lemnitzer met with Italian Defense Minister Giulio Andreotti, a rising star of Italy's Christian Democratic Party, just a few months after American Jupiter missiles had been deployed in Italy and Turkey. Here he's pictured, Andreotti is pictured with McNamara, Secretary of Defense McNamara, on that same trip where Andreotti called on Lemnitzer undoubtedly to discuss what was coming up in a moment when Lemnitzer would show up as the SACEUR. So the irony is that Lemnitzer, in his new job as the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, he would inherit the very covert operations, covert armies that he had helped create after World War II, Operation Gladio. This was an inadvertent, unintentional gift from President Kennedy. The assassins and terrorists under NATO were still active in Italy during June 1963, when President Kennedy went there to spread his mission of world peace. This interesting map here shows exactly when the Jupiter missiles and where the Jupiter missiles were deployed in Italy. In April 1959, Eisenhower approved the deployment of two United States Air Force Jupiter intermediate range ballistic missile squadrons in Italy and one squadron in Turkey. Between February and July of 1961, 30 missiles were deployed at 10 sites in Italy and 15 missiles deployed in Turkey. United States Air Force personnel retained control of arming the warheads, but these missiles were largely obsolete by the time they were installed. The Polaris missiles were coming, Polaris submarines were coming online. The Jupiters were removed in April 1963 as a backdoor trade for the early removal of Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles from Cuba to end the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. The rebirth of Propaganda Massonica as Lodge P2, Propaganda Due. In the 1950s, the Central Intelligence Agency under Allen Dulles, himself a 33rd degree Mason, helped turn P2 into the most dominant Masonic lodge in Italy. In June 1963, Pope Paul VI's knighting of Licio Gelli in the Order of Sylvester cemented the Vatican P2 bond and the Vatican's reliance on the Central Intelligence Agency and Gelli. In 1963, Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, Vernon Walters, and other CIA officials arranged for Gelli to join the Rom Agnasi Lodge and gain 33rd degree membership virtually overnight. In early 1964, Gelli was appointed Secretary of P2 under CIA contractor Giordano Gambarini and Giulio Andreotti, Defense Minister and leader of the Christian Democratic Party in Italy. By 1970, Gelli became P2's new worshipful master. By 1980, Gelli's P2 US branches had notable members like former Nixon Chief of Staff, General Alexander Haig, and former Nixon Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. General Lemnitzer was a serious Freemason. In 1922, he joined the Freemasons in Rhode Island. And 33 years later, November 1955, he was initiated into the Scottish Rite as a 32nd degree Mason and entered the Mystic Shrine. In April 1960, he was presented with a 33rd degree Jewel of the Scottish Rite. In December 1962, he became the honorary president of the National Sojourners in Paris, that chapter. That's when he was SACEUR. In March 1967, he was designated an honorary 33rd degree member of the Scottish Rite of France. For photographs, he would always show the back of his left hand with his West Point class ring that also carried the Masonic emblem, as you can see here. In my book, in my view, in my opinion, lying to Americans to get them to approve invading Cuba was dishonorable. After President Kennedy's rebuke of Lemnitzer's Northwood false flag plan for invading Cuba, he arrived in Paris in 1962 and became the honorary president of the National Sojourners Paris chapter. Now, Scottish Rite mystic Shriners are well known for helping children in hospitals. But National Sojourners were Masons who were serving or had served honorably in the U.S. Armed Forces. Lemnitzer's message to the 1963 Sojourners Convention in Paris praised them for working, quote, to protect those inalienable rights of individual freedom and the American way of life handed down to us by the founding fathers, unquote. U.S. Army General McChristian, when asked what it means to lie about the enemy at the time of war, answered, "It threatens not only the lives of soldiers on the battlefield, but also the future liberty of your people at home. It's dishonorable." Now, I mentioned General McChristian at the end of part 2. And so here again, I invoke his message. As this was the time, in June 1963, that President Kennedy found the courage of his convictions to stand up for racial justice in America and peace and détente with the Soviet Union and the left in Europe. President Kennedy's mission for world peace and racial justice. All these things here happened in June 1963. On the 10th, JFK gave his famous speech at American University to defuse the Cold War. On 11th June, the next day, Kennedy's televised address was given to, with respect to racial justice in America. On the 30th of June, President Kennedy went to Italy to promote an opening to the left. What JFK did not know during his Rome visit was that CIA Chief of Station Harvey and Lemnitzer at NATO were moving Italy far to the right. And what JFK also did not know at that time was that he had just 144 days to live. Well, the time has come for me to wrap up the formal part of my presentation this evening. And I'm going to do that on the subject of Vietnam. From May 62, where we left off in part 4, through November 1963 and the death of JFK. I call it the war and the struggle for power. I'll begin with John Kenneth Galbraith's frank advice to JFK on Vietnam. He was the ambassador to India at the time. A month before the May 1962 order of battle deception in Saigon, discussed in section 4, a power struggle erupted over a reversal of US policy, quote unquote, in Vietnam. So Ambassador John Galbraith told President Kennedy that the USSR was pleased that we would spend our billions of dollars in these distant jungles where it does us no good and them no harm. Who decides what countries are strategic? I'd like to ask him what is so important about Vietnam in the space age. Immediately interested, Kennedy told his advisors to be prepared to seize upon any favorable moment to reduce our commitment to Vietnam, obviously. Already in the middle of a battle with JFK over Cuba. When he heard about the Galbraith proposal, Lemnitzer declared any reversal of US Vietnam policy would be disastrous for Vietnam and for US allies in Asia and elsewhere. So the intensity of the Joint Chiefs' opposition to Galbraith's proposal, and Averell Harriman, the Assistant Secretary of State for Asia and Pacific Affairs, and his disapproval at a 1 May National Security Council meeting sank any chance of a political settlement in Vietnam at the time. In the heat of that struggle with Lemnitzer over Cuba, JFK decided to say nothing more about his intention to pull the US advisors out of Vietnam. While all eyes were on the Soviet arms pouring into Cuba, both JFK and General Taylor were hiding their intentions about Vietnam from each other. The Vietnam battle in Washington fueled the May 1962 order of battle deception and false picture of success fed to McNamara in Saigon. Galbraith's proposal led to a storm that foreshadowed events to come. In 1962, President Kennedy sent Lemnitzer to Europe as the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe and nominated General Taylor for the CJCS slots, both mistakes. Like Lansdale, General Taylor was an ally of Lemnitzer. Anxious to secure the chairman of the Joint Chiefs job, General Taylor said little on Vietnam and hid what he knew about the order of battle deception from JFK. Behind McNamara's back, Taylor would gut JFK's order to begin withdrawing from Vietnam during the weeks before his murder. The high price of the June 1960 Laos settlement. Prince Savannah Phuma declared Laos neutral and objected to the presence of US forces. While all US forces were withdrawn, nearly 10,000 North Vietnamese troops remained, and the US did not make it a casus belli. After the Laos settlement was ratified by the Geneva Conference, the upsurge of Soviet soldiers in arms arriving in Cuba began in July. A week before the 13-day Cuban Missile Crisis began, President Kennedy ordered the withdrawal of all US military forces from Laos, leaving the communists free to infiltrate into South Vietnam. What was happening in Vietnam was, as Neil Sheehan wrote in his book, a bright, shining lie. Lieutenant Colonel John Paul Vann was the US advisor to Colonel Cao, the 7th Division commander in the best division in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN. Vann told the senior American advisor in 3 Corps that he doubted Cao's battlefield claims. Vann felt that ARVN's so-called battle successes were, quote, walks in the sun, unquote. Cao was afraid to fight the VC. After killing a few, he would let the rest go. In July, President Diem threatened to deny Cao a promotion to Corps commander when Cao lost 20 men in one fight. That brought an end to any effective 7th Division operations against the Viet Cong for the rest of 1962, losing only 3 dead. And Colonel Cao did get his promotion. So the myth of battlefield success is shaken, but General Taylor reassures. Ambassador at Large Bowles, told Secretary of State Dean Rusk that the continuing deterioration in Vietnam could force a choice between sending in US combat troops or a total withdrawal of the US advisors. And he was right. That's why the deception was going on. Back in Vietnam in August of 1962, Saigon US Consul Joseph Mendenhall said the war could not be won with Diem, therefore get rid of Diem. Let me repeat that. Back from Vietnam in August 62, Saigon US Consul Joseph Mendenhall said the war could not be won with Diem, therefore get rid of Diem. In September, General Taylor went to Vietnam, brushed aside John Paul Vann's truthful report, and then returned to JFK with a false report of much progress. At the Battle of Ap Bac, all hell breaks loose. On 2 January 1963, 10 U.S. helicopters helped discharge 3 battalions, that would be 18 companies worth, of the ARVN 7th Division to surround 2 Viet Cong companies. In the absence of unity of command and coordination of fire maneuver, the operation was doomed. ARVN losses were 80 dead and more than 100 wounded. U.S. losses were 3 dead, 8 wounded, and the loss of 5 helicopters. So the Battle of Atbara is looked at as a turning point. And at that time, the CIA began to challenge the Viet Cong strength figures that MACV was putting out. They didn't like what Harkins was saying about winning. If, as MACV claimed, the Viet Cong strength had increased from 17,600 to 24,000 while suffering 3,000 casualties, a reasonable person would be justified in asking, just who are we fighting out there? The CIA report said that these statistics suggested that, quote, the casualty figures are exaggerated, or the Viet Cong have a remarkable capability, or both. In other words, the Viet Cong would have to have recruited 37,000 men in less than 12 months. The big lie was falling apart. In the spring of 1963, the web of deception in Vietnam was still deepening. By the end of '62, President Kennedy suspected that Harkins' reports of battlefield success were fiction. So he sent Senator Mike Mansfield to investigate in Vietnam. Mansfield returned with a pessimistic report. My book, JFK in Vietnam, actually my dissertation, JFK in Vietnam, broke the story that by early 1963, Kennedy and McNamara were working on a secret withdrawal plan. Secretary Rusk and General Taylor were excluded. Knowing his Vietnam policy was a failure, JFK was planning to begin pulling out US advisors in 1964 and everybody out after his reelection. But publicly, JFK opposed a US withdrawal. He said, sitting there with the Mansfield, he said, I got angry with Mike for disagreeing with our policy so completely, and I got angry with myself because I found myself agreeing with him. And then came the Buddhist crisis. Things got worse, a whole lot worse. In April 1965, Thuc, the Archbishop of Hue, and Diem's brother, encouraged the flying of papal flags, while Khan, the Hue government chief and also a brother of Diem, banned the display of religious flags just before the Buddha's birthday. When the Buddhists flew their flags anyway on 8 May, the Catholic deputy province chief ordered his troops to fire on the crowd. In June, the Diem government's lie that a Viet Cong agent's grenade triggered a stampede was exposed by films of troops firing into the crowds. And that caused thousands of Buddhists to swarm into the streets in demonstrations. When the smoke cleared on 9 May, 15 Buddhists were injured and 7 killed, including 2 children crushed by armored vehicles. The Buddhist crisis deepened, continuing in June through July and August of 1963. The US pressured Diem to mollify the Buddhists. And on 14 June, JFK replaced Ambassador Nolting with Henry Cabot Lodge in Saigon. On 10 July, a special national intelligence estimate, CIA estimate on South Vietnam concluded that if the Diem regime failed to appease the Buddhists, more demonstrations would result, along with the strong possibility of a coup attempt in Vietnam. On 21 August, after 7 more monks and 1 nun put the match themselves, Diem placed South Vietnam under martial law, and his brother Nhu ordered raids on pagodas, resulting in arrests of 1,400 Buddhists. It was on 11 June that Thich Quang Duc shocked the world and electrified South Vietnam by becoming the first monk to burn himself to death. The Buddhist crisis caused the political bottom to fall out of South Vietnam, whose generals began plotting a coup against Diem and his brother Nhu. In August, US officials were as divided in Washington as they were in Saigon over a coup. President Kennedy was away at Hyannisport. when Roger Hilsman, Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs, and the pro-coup group falsely convinced their foes that JFK had approved a coup, and a go-ahead cable was sent to Saigon on 24 August. Crucially, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Taylor managed to hide during this charade. For the next week, chaos reigned in the White House meetings. Then the generals in Saigon called off the coup. JFK went back to Hyannisport, and an angry LBJ told a high-level White House meeting, "Stop playing cops and robbers." The 8th through 10 September 1963 Krulak-Mendenhall trip to Vietnam. Due to a 3 September Robert Kennedy request for views on the war effort by US advisors in South Vietnamese units, McNamara and Taylor sent the Pentagon Saxa, the Special Assistant for Counterinsurgency and Special Activities, General Krulak, and balanced by the State Department's Joseph Mendenhall, to Vietnam to find out what was happening. So they briefed JFK on 10 September when they got back. Krulak had spoken to 80 US advisors and told JFK that despite Diem's defects, the war would be won if the current US military and civil programs were pursued. Mendenhall talked to South Vietnam and US civilian officials and said he found a virtual breakdown of the government in Saigon in an atmosphere of fear, and that the war could not be won if Diem's brother Nhu remained in Vietnam. Incredulous, Kennedy asked, "The two of you did visit the same country, didn't you?" Now let me turn to the genesis of Op Plan 34A and the Americanization of the war in Vietnam. According to the 6th May Secretary of Defense Conference agenda, item number 5, South Vietnam operations against the North, was being reported separately by General Krulak. But the State Department history says no such record has been found. The reason for that is outrageous. General Taylor was planning to approve CINCPAC, Commander-in-Chief Pacific, Operations Plan 34A while hiding it from McNamara and JFK. Taylor sat on the plan for several months before allowing it to be shown to McNamara at the 20 November Honolulu conference, 2 days before the Kennedy assassination. Now let me add a few things here that I should put on the table. In volume 4, Armageddon, I'm vetting the hypothesis that General Taylor, who at the time was still just the military aide to Kennedy, was actually a Trojan horse who had penetrated the inner sanctum of the Kennedy administration. And I'm also tracking the evidence that beginning in early May 63, General Taylor and General Krulak were secretly working behind Secretary McNamara's back on an up plan to Americanize the war in Vietnam. And so this is what I have so far. Let me go to the next slide. The CINCPAC, the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Op Plan 3463, eventually became Op Plan 34A. Anyway, 3463's hazy history began with the disappearance of Krulak's presentation in the May 63 SecDef meeting. When Taylor finally put it on the table in front of McNamara at the 20 November SecDef meeting in Honolulu, it included the unilateral use of American forces against North Vietnam. Taylor's secret plan for American covert operations against North Vietnam remained pigeonholed. JFK never saw it. It was put into play, as I say, 48 hours before his murder, and it led directly to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and full-scale American intervention in the Vietnam War. President Kennedy's needs. JFK was desperate to preserve his plan to begin the US extrication from Vietnam in 1964. But the political collapse of the Diem regime during the summer of 1963 with the Buddhist crisis forced JFK to start it right away in order to, quote, cast it in concrete, unquote, before the interventionists had time to react. JFK then decided to send McNamara to Vietnam and told him to return with a secret proposal to begin the withdrawal so JFK could use it as he saw fit. Now, President Kennedy included General Taylor on the trip, but without letting him know about the plan. Taylor thought the 1,000-man pullout was only a trick to pressure Diem. That is the 1,000-man pullout in '63. General Krulak was used in Washington to maintain constant contact with the operation in Vietnam, McNamara-Taylor trip, so that Kennedy could play the key role in shaping the final recommendations at the last minute. At a stopover in Honolulu on the way back, the 1,000-man withdrawal was slipped into the report. On the final leg of the journey, Assistant Undersecretary of State William Sullivan saw it and went postal, and McNamara agreed to scrub it when Sullivan threatened to write a dissenting report. And so the 1,000-man withdrawal for the end of 1963 was excised in the Honolulu version of the report. After the helicopter landed and McNamara and Taylor joined Kennedy in the White House briefing room after a photo op with the leather-bound report at the coffee table, JFK listened to an oral summary of the McNamara-Taylor report's recommendations. Then, while the onlookers had to remain in their leather seats, the president, on cue, directed McNamara and Taylor into the Oval Office for a private discussion. When the three men emerged, McNamara ordered the recommendation on the 1,000-man withdrawal to be put back into the report. And then President Kennedy just steamrolled over his opposition. JFK's National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy, and the Assistant for Policy Support from the CIA, Chester Cooper, Joint State Department's Assistant Undersecretary of State William Sullivan, and Assistant Secretary William Bundy, all of them together to plead their opposition to the 1,000-man withdrawal in vain all day long. But they were just subordinates. The principals, Secretary of Defense McNamara, Secretary of State Rusk, and Director of Central Intelligence McCone stood with JFK. In a meeting at the end of the day, JFK steamrolled over his opposition and demanded obedience and declared, "We have a policy." To avoid being overly optimistic, JFK sent McNamara out to the White House steps to make the announcement so that the withdrawal would be his recommendation, not JFK's, thus giving the president some time to wait and see before making it his call. The somewhat secret National Security Action Memorandum 263. JFK left himself the option of implementing the 1,000-man withdrawal as he saw fit. And the way he saw fit was to do so secretly. So on 5 October, JFK approved the McNamara-Taylor military recommendations, but JFK insisted that the pullout of 1,000 men by the end of 1963 had to remain secret for the time being. JFK's opposition leaked his secret pullout and appeared in the New York Times. On 11 October, National Security Aide McGeorge Bundy said we might as well formally write it up, the 2 October decision in NSAM 263, if it's in the newspapers. It also included, by the way, that NSAM, pictured here, a telegram for Ambassador Lodge. It's in paragraph 3 here, greenlighting a coup in South Vietnam. The 1 November execution of the Diem and New brothers. On 9 October, the message sent to Lodge and the generals in South Vietnam was, while we do not wish to stimulate a coup, we do not wish to thwart a change of government. JFK's 23 October guidance that the burden of proof that the coup could succeed rested with the generals did not discourage them. Diem and New were executed on 1 November, both shot in the nape of the neck. During a meeting the next morning, JFK was shown a cable with the news of the terrible outcome. General Taylor described JFK's visceral reaction. Quote, he leapt to his feet and rushed from the room with a look of shock and dismay on his face which I had never seen before. He had always insisted that Diem must never suffer more than exile. Turning to the Honolulu agenda and the end of the optimistic interlude. In mid-October, news from Lodge in Saigon exposed MACV's charade of military success. When General Taylor and the chiefs, who had supported the myth of success by MACV's myth of success, discovered JFK's true intent to pull out of Vietnam, they secretly reversed course and planned to deny Kennedy a pullout based upon a winning scenario. Taylor, Krulak, and others that I will mention in my volume 4, Armageddon, continued to work behind McNamara's back on the secret Op Plan 34A to Americanize the war while gutting Kennedy's 1,000-man pullout. Then the chiefs confronted McNamara with the truth 2 days before Kennedy's assassination at the SecDef conference in Honolulu. NSAM 273. So NSAM 273 was originally written by McGeorge Bundy the day before Kennedy was assassinated. And then it was revised after the assassination on 26 November. The key part of the change in NSAM 273 was to allow the Americanization of the war. Paragraph 7 was the key. What you're looking at here, McGeorge Bundy's 21 November draft on the top left only called for increasing Vietnamese resources to step up the war effort. Bundy told me on 24 November, LBJ told him to strike that paragraph completely, thus the two big hash marks through there. At that time, JFK's body was still laying in state at the Capitol Rotunda. But you can see the difference, top right. Bundy's 26 November final NSAM on on LBJ's orders reversed JFK's NSAM 263 and allowed war planners to implement Op Plan 34A. You can see here that if you're a war planner, if you read the fine print here, there's nothing that ruling out direct American action in Vietnam now. JFK's assassination opened the gates of hell. During the days before his assassination, his withdrawal plan withered, while Op Plan 34A sprouted on 20 November. 4 days after the assassination, withdrawal plan died, while the plan for US intervention in Vietnam blossomed. In January, LBJ approved General Krulak's proposal for Op Plan 34A DeSoto patrols by United States Navy destroyers in the Tonkin Gulf to paint North Vietnam's electronic intelligence defenses and support infiltration into North Vietnam. The 2 August incident involving the USS Maddox was the match that lit the tinderbox. It led the US Congress to pass the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, issuing a blank check for LBJ to wage war against North Vietnam. We now turn to the conclusion of my presentation this evening. With President Kennedy gone, both Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King stepped into to stop the coming Holocaust in Vietnam, but they too paid the ultimate price. Beside the American dead, 4 million Vietnamese died in that war. Most countries in the world along the supply routes to Vietnam became targets of coups by both the US and the USSR. I will leave it to others to figure out how many shooters were involved in the Dealey Plaza murder. My current working hypothesis, which I could always change, but right now, this is what it is. JFK was assassinated in a coup d'etat. The center of this conspiracy was in the military, with assistance by elements of the Central Intelligence Agency. I would now be happy to take more questions.
Okay. Thank you, John, for that excellent presentation on the nature of the relationship that President Kennedy had with the national security establishment and, of course, the devolving nature of that relationship. So we're now ready to move into Q&A. Keep in mind that if you have a question, please address it on the Q&A button rather than the chat button. And right now it's about 9:05 p.m. Eastern time. We need to wrap up by 9:45 to make sure that the entire presentation appears on videotape. So let's get right into it. First question from Douglas. My question pertains to part 3 about JFK in Berlin. How important was the Berlin crisis for Kennedy's policy toward Cuba and the Vietnam War?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's integral. Kennedy would not put forces in either Cuba or Southeast Asia. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So when he was shown that if even 10,000 U.S. combat forces were placed into Cuba, that we've been unable to do anything in Berlin, he was shocked. And this is what was going on. So you begin to have to ask the question, well, why were the Joint Chiefs asking to go to war with ground forces all over the place, in Europe, in Cuba, in Southeast Asia? And there can only be one answer to that. It's because they believed they were not going to have to use all those ground forces. They were assuming there was going to be a nuclear war. That's where I'm going in volume 4 now. It looks like they wanted those missiles to go into Cuba. They wanted to take out the USSR and China. And Kennedy was shocked. He said, they showed him the plan. He said, why are there all these Chinese targets in here? In this scenario, they didn't start the war. And Lemnitzer said, well, it's in the plan. So Kennedy understood that we didn't have enough he didn't intend to go to nuclear war. And so he wanted to make our ground forces stronger, but it wasn't enough, not near enough. So there was no way was he going to allow West Berlin to be sacrificed by putting troops in these other theaters. But understand this also. This was Soviet strategy. I spoke to this in my presentation at least one place. Shelepin, the Soviet KGB chief, told Khrushchev, that's how we get Berlin. You tie them down here and you tie them down there, and then they can't stop us. So from the very beginning, you cannot separate Kennedy's decisions on Vietnam policy and Cuban policy without understanding that the first plays in the center of Europe. And that's what he was defending.
Okay. Question from Will. The DRE was operational and effective inside of Cuba until they were given up to Castro by a G2 agent. This resulted in the DRE inside of Cuba becoming operationally ineffective. Many arrests resulted and essentially ended the DRE's run in Cuba. The G2 agent who gave up the entire DRE inside of Cuba was Carlos Bringuer's nephew, Jorge Medina Bringuer. What, if anything, do you make of this?
Well, it's been a long time since I looked at that, so I can't really address that. I didn't talk about that tonight. I will tell you that very quickly, Castro's forces had infiltrated, his police had infiltrated all of those groups, not just the DRE. And so while some of those groups, including the DRE, could continue to be used by the CIA in Miami or elsewhere or other countries, they had no capability to use any of those groups inside of Cuba.
Okay, question from Lawrence. What does CTD refer to? John's book?
Yeah. So you had mentioned my books, and so I didn't want to take up unnecessary time, but that's a acronym for a book title, Countdown to Darkness. Okay. ITS is for Into the Storm. I didn't have enough room on the bottom of all those slides to get all that stuff in there. So watch out for those acronyms, but I give you book titles, I give you chapters, and I give you page ranges to, if you would like, to pursue and look at all these slides again, because there's stuff on them that I didn't have time to mention, but they're all there for people to pursue in their own time.
Okay, Stuart says, why did the CIA want to sabotage President Kennedy so much?
Well, it's a difficult question because we think of the CIA and even the Pentagon as being monolithic, and they're really not. John McCone didn't certainly do, want to do that. But a lot of people did, a lot of senior people, and I'm working on that real hard right now. It's clear to me that Lemnitzer, He had it in for Kennedy from the beginning. Didn't like him. I've collected a lot of his statements. Some of them were private about Kennedy's inexperience and why he wasn't fit to be president. And there are many other generals that I'm looking at in volume 4, some of the way high up in the Pentagon. But the Pentagon is not the answer itself. It's the military. We've got military all over the place, not just in the Pentagon. The head of the National Security Agency has to be a military man, and the deputy has to be civilian. And it's the other way around in the CIA. So you have spread throughout all of these organizations, military officers whose real loyalty is not to that organization, it's to their service, or even smaller, to the people they went to to school with. And so Taylor and Lemnitzer and Carter and those guys, they were all on the same team. They didn't like Kennedy. And so I wouldn't say it's the entire CIA. And when we talk about the assassination, by the way, which I am not really going to get to that till volume 5, because that's late 1963. But I said in the very beginning, way back in volume 1, in my list of hypotheses and assumptions, that I felt that one thing the CIA was certainly involved in at a very high level, Angleton, the counterintelligence chief in particular, fixed Oswald's files, wouldn't allow all the stuff that he had been doing in New Orleans and Mexico City to go into his official CIA 201 file. They were hidden. And so when Kennedy was assassinated on 11/22/63, and everybody went running down the hallways to open up the triple combination safes, there those documents were. And they tried to destroy them. They panicked. And there was it was a long time before we actually got those files, because people, to protect themselves, had been making their own copies in their desk drawers. So we eventually got multiple copies of all the Oswald files that had been pigeonholed. So the idea of not letting that come out before the assassination, if it had, they would have taken Oswald, the FBI would have taken Oswald off the parade route. But somebody turned off the switch on him. And so that's where we're going here. The CIA played a very active role before the assassination in setting things up so that it would panic at the secret level people into thinking that we'd almost started World War III. And in order to stop World War III, and Earl Warren believed this, he cooperated. But so what hasn't happened yet is that we haven't really been able to talk about where is the galactic center of this conspiracy. And there is where I mentioned the name Veciana. I didn't try and get into it, but that he was one of several great misdirections that have been going on for years that we need to dispense with, which I did in volume 3, which is why it was a book that opened up things and put us into a new place. But for some reason, the Pentagon and the military has been getting a pass all these years in our researchers. You don't see hardly anybody. I remember a guy called John Judge, whose mother worked in the Pentagon, and he used to talk about it, but I'm amazed. All the transcripts of all the Joint Chiefs of Staff's personal meetings, not with other organizations, but their own daily or weekly meetings from 1945 to 1978 have been destroyed. They're gone. And if that had happened at the top of the CIA, if all the top CIA meetings from the time of its creation until 1978 had been destroyed, you'd hear people screaming from the rafters, why do these generals get a pass? And so I think that what's happening in my works, as we move forward through these volumes, is we're beginning to see that there is it's in the military. But if you just say it's the Pentagon, you're putting everybody into that box, and you shouldn't do that. Well, what about somebody like Lemnitzer? He's not even in the Pentagon anymore. He's over there in Europe. So that's why I say that it appears to me that and it's a hypothesis for right now, but it looks like that's the direction I'm moving in anyway. I'm finding the center of this galaxy, of this conspiracy, is located in the military. By the way, they kill people better than the CIA does, but with assistance from elements of the CIA.
Okay, Stuart asks, was Kennedy perceived to be a threat to world domination plans?
Yeah, that's easy. Yes.
Okay, John asks, by coincidence, I myself also happen to be a Cold War veteran and fellow military intel vet as well, Marine Corps. Question, the Communist Party of North Vietnam, like that of many other communist countries, was divided into two main factions, one pro-Soviet, Ho Chi Minh, and the other Maoist, Le Duan. It has now been revealed that between 23 to 24 November 63, there occurred a coup that removed Ho from power and replaced him with the more militant Le Duan. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it says interesting. I don't know about that coup. I have no information about it, but I know that for a long time, the North Vietnamese Communist Party was actually trying to play Moscow off against Beijing so that they could get weapons and support from both of them. So yes, there were factions, of course, in that party, the Le Duan party.
All right, Charlie asks, I understand why JFK was presented with rosy numbers about the operation in Vietnam, but why was it important for LBJ to be provided the real and accurate numbers?
Okay, I'm writing a lot about this now in volume 4. I spent a lot of time down at the LBJ library getting a huge amount of material, all the Burris memos to his boss. So the short answer is that it was Burris's job to prepare LBJ to take over the job. And that preparation is going on early on. And I had several interviews with Burris in the late 80s. We had at least a half a dozen meetings. And he gave me a lot of good stuff that I put in JFK Invented about that order of battle deception and how he got the memos and he got the information and sent these memos to LBJ. But what he was telling me was LBJ was telling him what to do. And from the very beginning, he told me that LBJ had pulled him off an oil rig way back in the 40s and ordered him to go into war in Europe. And then when LBJ became vice president, and Burris was he's in CIA at the time, running agent nets in Switzerland, LBJ ordered me to come back. So LBJ says, jump, and Burris jumps. But actually what you find when you go through all of the files, not people's books, but all the files, Burris tells LBJ what to do. And LBJ says, well, all right, Howard, if that's the way you want it, and he's drunk half the time. And so Burris's job is to make sure that he's fully informed, and he is. And it's not just on Vietnam. When you look at every day, Burris has all the straight skinny, and everybody else who's reporting directly to Kennedy through the National Security Council is only proposing things to the president that they want him to do. They're not just giving him the news, whatever's happening. LBJ is getting unfettered, true stuff across the board on every issue around the world. Whether or not he even bothered to remember it or read it is another question, but that's what was going on. Now, by the time we get to close to the assassination, Burris is gone. He leaves. He's done his job, and he's out of the country, going back over to Europe. He's hiding over there for a while, and he's talking to I forget the name of it, LBJ's top aide at the time, Jenkins was his name. And so Burris is now coaxing Jenkins and telling him how to handle LBJ, telling him what to do and making sure he doesn't, say the wrong thing. And so that's what I think is going on with this back channel. The importance of LBJ knowing what's actually happening is to put him into a position. If he has to take over, he'll do what he's supposed to do.
Okay, Howard asks, why wasn't Lemnitzer fired, or was he?
No, it technically, it's both. In other words, Kennedy could have, if he had wanted to, extended him as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but he was due to be rotated out of that job. So technically, he had to go somewhere. Okay. Now, it's really clear that Kennedy wanted to get rid of him, did not know what was going on in Europe with these secret armies, and was afraid. He was afraid of the Joint Chiefs. He was particularly afraid of Lemnitzer. And that's why President Kennedy, when he read the book, 7 Days in May, suggested to the authors that they do a movie using the White House. And so the 7 Days, it's an interesting film to watch. It's pretty close to what looks like might have happened had there been a coup. And so I think that's one of the reasons that Kennedy didn't just, what he should have done. Obviously, the questioner is certainly perceptive. He should have just fired him. He should have not even allowed him to finish his service time into 63. He should have just, in fact, he should have fired them all at the beginning, way back, and he never did that. Why did he let all those generals stay for a whole year afterwards? He was picking off one here, picking off one there. He should have cleaned the place out and put his own folks in. And so it bit him in, he got bit in the end by not taking the bull by the horns and putting reliable people in place early on in the CIA and the Pentagon.
Okay, Jim says, if the invasion of Cuba was such a central issue, why did the U.S. not invade Cuba once JFK was out of the way?
By that point, it was all about Vietnam. And there's another point too. So this whole idea of killing Castro becomes very interesting once you get into whatever you think the plot is. And I'm not talking about forensics and all that type of stuff. But the World War III plot that Oswald was working for Castro and the KGB requires that Castro has to be alive after the assassination. If he's dead, he can't be the one who's behind the operation. So when you look at the anti-Castro operations of the Central Intelligence Agency, almost 90% of them that have anything to do with Cuban policy are for assassinating Castro. But there's a smaller group of them that look like they do, but they don't want to give Rolando Cubela, who was a defector in the summer of 62, they don't want to give him a rifle with a scope. He's already killed people. And so I'm moving towards the idea that there's a group that knew that Kennedy was going to die, that wanted to make sure Castro was alive and didn't want an invasion. Now, they could have, if they wanted to invade Cuba and get away with it, and with the plot I'm talking about, then they would have done that maybe in 64 or 65. But by that time, we are up to Viet Cong and our eyeballs. And Westmoreland's getting to the point where he asks LBJ, can I use tactical nuclear weapons, to pour chestnuts out of the fire here? So I think it's inconceivable after 65 or 66 that we're going to be invading Cuba with what was happening in Vietnam.
Okay, Charlotte asks, what's a false flag operation?
It means to pull. Now, the Gladio folks were doing this, and that was what Lemnitzer was trying to do. What it means is to do something and make it look like somebody else did it. In particular, with the Gladio units, they wanted to make it look like the communists. They would go shoot people, murder them, and say, oh, look at those bad communists. They murdered, and it wasn't at all. So in the Northwoods case, the idea was that Lemnitzer wanted us to sink one of our ships at Guantanamo, wanted us to kill some people in Miami, some Americans, and also in Washington, D.C. to shoot some people fleeing Cuba in boats and then to trick the American people into thinking that Castro had done all that, and therefore they would want us to go to war in Cuba. That's a false flag operation. You know, in other words, it's like a metaphor. Is that your dog wanting to go outside?
No, she's hears something.
Okay.
She's protecting me. So,
well, anyway, false flag operation is to do something that you don't want people to know who really did it, and that way you can make believe that this group did it or that group did it. But what it means is it's certainly not true.
Okay. Alan asked, could you describe in what ways your new series on the Kennedy presidency and his assassination evolved from one volume to the next?
Sure. Volume 1. By the way, I need to include also JFK in Vietnam, because as this evolution of the multi-volume series is going along, all of a sudden the second edition of JFK in Vietnam works into this. But I started in volume 1 just going back to the 50s, even into the late 40s, and started watching some of the characters that show up at the end of our story, making sure I'm following Phillips and others, and Harvey and so on. So I just, the first volume was like going back to square one. Volume 2 was to take a very close look at the transition between the Eisenhower administration and the Kennedy administration. And there were some real shockers there. I did not understand Eisenhower. I thought I did. I thought he was a nice guy. He gave us that, that famous speech when he's actually, cooking up a Cold War triple play in order to get Castro. So it was volume 3 that changed everything. There were really 3 huge deceptions that have been going on for years. One was Yuri Nosenko. Now, not everybody knows about this story, but he was a Soviet KGB false defector who came over to our side in '62 in Geneva, and then later, after the Kennedy assassination, defected for real and went to the United States. His mission was to conceal what the KGB was doing with Oswald in the Soviet Union when he was there. Number 2 was this guy Vesiana was talking about. He's an anti-Castro Cuban exile who wanted to kill Castro, but that's not the real story. The real story is that he got put in jail for cocaine trafficking, and he was used during the investigations by the Church Committee and the House Select Committee in order to make it look, to conceal the role of the Pentagon and the chiefs. That's what that was for. I'm not going to go through all the. It's, like I said, it's on my website. You can look at it, a long presentation I've done. But and the third one was a CIA staff officer. His name was Sam Halpern. He worked for Bill Harvey in the Cuban task force, but he didn't know that Harvey was the one who was actually working with the mafia to get an assassination plot going against Castro. And Halpern thought Bobby Kennedy, or he wanted to think Bobby Kennedy was the one who was behind that. And he spent the rest of his life, all the way up to like almost 2000, insisting that Bobby Kennedy was the one who was behind that, got his brother killed, and almost started World War III. So when you take these 3, you got a Cuban, you got a Russian, and an American, and they're being used for reasons, many different reasons, to give us a scenario that is not true. And it screws up everything. Some of the stuff was laid from the 70s, was laid in over 62 and 63. So when you remove all that's false, what do you end up with? In a brand new place, it's like an orchard. You're all alone in it with low-hanging fruit everywhere you look. You turn this way or that way, and there it is. It's easy to see what really happened when you remove all the false stories. And that's what volume 3 did. And and I realized that as I began to work my way through Mongoose and the approach to the Cuban Missile Crisis, boy, I needed some time off. I didn't know what I was talking about. And so I've spent 27 months already seeing where the story is leading me now. And I've got the rest of this year. So it's going to end up being a 3-year project to pick up where I left off in volume 3 and finish the job in volume 4. Now, the same thing could be said about JFK in Vietnam, because what's happening in volume 3 is all of a sudden Taylor's looking like a bad guy. He's doing stuff that Kennedy told him not to do. And he was controlling Vietnam policy under Kennedy as his military aide. Well, after he came back and with a proposal to send combat troops to Vietnam under a flood release task force cover, Kennedy got really angry, and he lost control of Vietnam, and that's why Kennedy fired everybody, and McNamara took over, and the SecDef conferences began to happen. So anyway, I'll stop on Taylor. I could go on probably for another 10, 15 minutes as I keep dot after dot after dot. And so, and it's not just Taylor. All of a sudden, Harvey, I'm finding the stuff out about him going way back to all the work he did with safecrackers and assassins, going way back. And then after he was in Berlin and just before he comes to the CIA, he takes this long trip all over Europe and hangs out with all these bad guys. And he ends up in, guess where? In Italy, in Rome, as the case officer at a key point in this whole story. So anyway, I guess that's enough for now. Finding out, exposing, and overturning misdirections is what we need to do before we're ever going to know who was really behind this thing. I'm not talking about who's shooting. I'm talking about who was actually had figured it out, what group, what nucleus was really at the center of this whole thing. I can't hear you.
Sorry, muted myself. John wants to know if Operation Gladio is going to be covered in your volume 4. Yes.
Well, we've got a lot more to do. I only showed a few slides just to give you a taste of. It's an awful story. It's a really awful story. A lot of people were murdered and killed, and I would say a couple of things. Two areas that I'm going to really be pursuing more are going to be the importance of the Vatican, or actually the relationship between the Vatican and the CIA and narcotics trafficking. And there's going to be a whole lot more detail on the CIA officers who came forward on camera, even though the agency will never admit it. It hasn't and won't. But senior officers have actually now gone on camera and said what they knew was happening. And so there's going to be at least one chapter 3, if not a second one somewhere in volume 4.
Okay. Bob says, was Vietnam purely a means to an end, a starting point for escalation to full nuclear war with China and USSR, or an end unto itself, a protracted war that would benefit the military industries and suppliers?
Well, there's no doubt that the military suppliers were happy with all the money they were making off that war. There's no question about that. But I think I would superimpose the first part of the question on Laos and all of Southeast Asia, because that's where it's Straight to the Brink over Laos is a chapter in JFK in Vietnam, very early in the book. And yeah, they want, some of the chiefs wanted war. They wanted war. They wanted nuclear, especially LeMay. He said, look, they're not going to attack us if we go into Laos, but if they do, we'll just nuke them. And he said, by the way, why don't we get our good friend Chiang Kai-shek over there in Taiwan to attack Hainan Island, and then we'll take out China too. Yeah, that's actually in the record. That was LeMay's response. So yeah, he saw, and his successor at the Strategic Air Command, they wanted nuclear war. They wanted it back in the late 50s, and they wanted it in the early 60s, and that's what we almost what almost happened. But I wouldn't say that Vietnam was the the starting point for that. It was Laos. The only nuclear aspect of the Vietnam War was at the very end. We were in such bad shape that General Westmoreland, our commander of MACV over there, actually asked President Johnson to authorize the use of tactical nuclear weapons in Vietnam.
And who was LeMay?
Oh, General LeMay had for the longest time been the chief of the chief of the SAC, Strategic Air Command, and then later on after that he became the Air Force Chief of Staff.
Okay, Mike says, how do you think that the Joint Chiefs at this time interpreted NSD 68? Do you think their intention was just to defend against communism, but to banish it around the globe, and that JFK's move to coexist was at odds with their plans?
I think I wouldn't include all the generals in this. There are some that weren't quite that rabid, but most of them were, yes, to banish communism all over the world. And it wasn't just generals, by the way. At that time, when you get back into the 50s, you'll find a whole bunch of folks over there in the State Department that are just as rabid anti-communists as a lot of the military officers were. Scary.
Okay, scrolling through, trying to pick out the ones that I want to ask. Great presentation. Had you been a military advisor or trusted influence to President Kennedy, I think you've already sort of answered this, what would you have done differently than his advisors? What, if anything, could have been done while maintaining his policies to avoid him being overthrown? Besides the obvious, who should have been fired or replaced? Who should he have trusted that might have changed the outcome of his presidency? How could Kennedy have survived at that time and place? Or is that a complete impossibility in your opinion?
Well, there's a lot of questions there. I've already said that I think he did put a whole new team in place for economics and foreign policy and all that stuff. He didn't touch the military. He didn't touch the CIA. He should have done that early on, especially after the Bay of Pigs. Let's say, okay, maybe he didn't do it. I personally would have told him to get rid of him right away. But after the Bay of Pigs, that would have been it for me. And I would have been on that bandwagon right away. But then if we move downstream, it was the worst thing in the world to go after the Castro brothers again. There was nothing had changed. It was only worse, much, much worse. More Soviet weapons were in there. There were no viable groups on the island to do anything with. And so it was just a revenge thing. And it's unlike Kennedy's intellect, and Bobby was really rabid about it too. But yeah, I would have said no. Just like Galbraith. Galbraith was right. He was ambassador to India, by the way. Very smart guy, one of the smartest economists that did help Kennedy set up all the economic stuff before he sent him over to India to be the ambassador. But yeah, he got it right. I mean, we're squandering all of our power down there. It doesn't doing us any good, and doing the other side a lot of good, because we're tied down, getting nowhere.
Okay, Scott says, when Bill Harvey was sent to Rome, was that with the stay behind Operation Gladio specifically in mind for him to play a part?
No, they were just there. He was sent, but I believe that, and we had other people that had been there too. Bill Colby, who became the head of the CIA, he was there for a long time. But Bill Harvey liked what he saw. He endorsed the strategy of tension that was going on very actively in '63. But he was sent over there to get him away from the CIA because, he was lucky he didn't get just fired completely. So after Bobby fired him from the task force in the summer of '62, actually it's in October of '62, they kind of hide him in the basement for a while. He doesn't go to Rome until I guess it's the spring of 1963. So he's down there, they're giving him some make work. And then, and it's Helms, by the way, who's protecting him. And Helms is another guy on my radar screen. When I say I'm gonna have much more to say about somebody, that's my way of saying it's gonna be bad. And Helms is one of those guys. Helms and Burris were very close, for example. But so Helms protected Harvey and gave him a chief of staff position, no, excuse me, a chief of station position in Rome. And it doesn't get any bigger than that, because that's where the Vatican is. That's where a lot of the Gladio stuff is going on. And it's getting hotter and hotter, by the way, in Italy. More assassinations of political leaders going all the way up into the 60s. And so I think that NATO, in the form of Lemitzer, is not against that. If he was against it, he wouldn't have let it happen. And especially Harvey over there, it's a witch's brew. And yeah, so I'm not done looking at Harvey yet. There's a lot of other things about what he was doing in the summer of '62. I don't want to take up too much time. There's probably some more questions here we could field.
Well, let's just wrap it up with one last question, and that's by me. We just have a few minutes left. What was the extent of President Kennedy's knowledge of Gladio?
Zero.
Okay. That's a nice, succinct way to wrap up our presentation this evening. John, thank you very much. It's been absolutely excellent. Just what we had in mind as we developed this conference in a thematic way. Want to remind you all that we've got Jefferson Morley is going to be giving the next 2 presentations. We are adding 2 additional speakers on the medical evidence part of this conference. So it's going to be extending into May. Be sure to mark your calendar. And we look forward to seeing you all next week. And John, thank you so much again. It was great.
Thanks for inviting me. Enjoyed it.
On that note, we'll sign off. Thank you all for tuning in. Thanks for your great support of the Future of Freedom Foundation.